All right, let's get going. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 36 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat from mxdwn.com. That's Mixdown. So glad to see you well. Thanks for joining us for what looked like it would be kind of a quiet week. It has been an explosively busy week. So we have a whole lot of things to cover, a whole lot of ground to cover, a whole lot of things to talk about. Let's dive right into it. Just as a programming note, just as we did last year with our interview with Anjali Bamani, today we're going to have a special interview at the end of the broadcast with Patrick Trick Jarrett, who's from Wizards of the Coast, otherwise known as Magic the Gathering. Talk a little bit about that near the end of the show after the story. But first, let's dive into our first headline for today, which is from our good friends in Mixdown UK across the pond, which is the nominees have been announced for the Mercury Prize. Now, those of you that are North American music fans, unless you're an Anglophile of some sort and you're a big fan of what happens in British culture, you might not be familiar with the Mercury Prize. There's a few very big award shows on the other side of the pond in England and the UK. And one of them is the Brit Awards. That's just what it's called. It's called the Brit Awards. And one of the other really big ones that's been famous for quite a long time now is called the Mercury Prize. Now, unlike the Grammys or a lot of award shows you might be used to here in America, the Mercury Prize is usually a shortlisted series of about 8 or 10 albums, and one band, one album, 8 different ones, and effectively there is one person who wins. So there isn't numerous categories, there isn't a best new artist, there isn't best genre this, best genre that. It is literally just the Mercury Prize winner. Now, this has become a very prestigious thing in its own right. Sometimes there are folks who have won this award and their success is never really translated in America and the United States. And you can include people like Speech to Bell or Dizzy Rascal, who are really great artists, but just never really found popularity here in America. But over the years, some very luminous artists have won this with very incredible records. In 1995, Portishead's legendary album Dummy. 1996, Pulp's Different Class. In 2001, PJ Harvey's Stories from the City, Stories from the Sea, another excellent record. 2004, the self-titled Franz Ferdinand record, and talk about a breakout hit record if there ever really was one. In 2008, if you're not familiar with the band, you really should be. Elbow, the album The Seldom Seen Kid. And 2012, more recently, if you're a little bit more of a recent music fan, there was Alt J's and Awesome Wave, another great record. And then going all the way up to 2022, wherein last year it was won by Little Sims with her album Sometimes I Might Be Introvert. So this particular year, the shortlist is a super impressive list of nominees, and it includes people like Arctic Monkeys who've won in the past. So the nominees are Arctic Monkeys for The Car, Ezra Collective, Where I'm Meant to Be, Fred Again, Actual Life 3, J Hus, Beautiful and Brutal Yard, Jessie Ware, really great record, That Feels Good, or That Feels Good, depending on how you want to read it, Jockstrap, I Love You Jennifer, Lankum, False Lankum, Loyal Carner, Hugo, Olivia Dean, Messi, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Raye, My 21st Century Blues, Shy Girl, Nymph, and Young Fathers for Heavy Heavy. Elsewhere in the world of television. Now, we talked to you quite a lot about how there is the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes that have basically brought the creation, at least, of television and movies to a halt as far as the Western world is concerned. Now, this has spread to other things. You've started hearing about actors not being able to promote movies that they're in or TV shows that they're in. Certain things have started to get delayed. For example, Kraven the Hunter, which is going to be Sony's kind of version of the Marvel Universe, their movie, which was supposed to come out in October, has now been delayed until 2024. And ultimately, all kinds of things are either getting halted completely or the production's getting stopped. Curiously, one of the few things that's not House of the Dragon, since almost everyone in that show lives in the United Kingdom, and SAG-AFTRA isn't exactly who their membership and their actors are a part of, which is interesting. But at any rate, in the world of television, the Emmys, which usually happens different from the rest of the big award shows in September. This year it was supposed to be September 18th. It's been bumped. Variety has a reporting, and no one has really officially made a solid announcement yet as to what's happening. But apparently, because of the SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes, the thought is, and I wouldn't be surprised if it really comes down to that, a lot of the folks who they need to be their celebrities and talent to be on the show won't go because they don't want to be promoting shows or content. And that's of course a big part of the strike rules. They call it promoting struck content. So ultimately anything that's a part of the different companies and production companies and networks and movie production studios that are negotiating back and forth between these two different unions, I would guess that those people wouldn't show up, so it doesn't make sense to have the Emmys. This is my analysis, not anything as far as any official statement. But Variety's reporting seems to think that it could be on the air as early as November, but it might also be very likely that it's delayed till January. Now, a lot of you probably don't care very much about award shows like the Emmys, but I'll say for this part, the last few years, nominations in general have been much better. TV's obviously in its own little golden age here, coming at least to the end of its phase of having a big golden age. And this year, Succession had 27 nominations, and The Last of Us, which was a brilliant show, had 24. And there's all kinds of great stuff that has nominations in there. House of the Dragon and Ted Lasso and Andor. There's all kinds of really great content that's deservingly in there. And it's going to be a while before we find out if any of those shows win any awards elsewhere in the world of TV. And I would say, much to my chagrin and also our TV editor's chagrin, Secret Invasion, which was one of many shows that's been kind of teased and promoted as part of the endless continuity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And of course, now they're Disney Plus shows that have had things like Loki and the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and then very successfully WandaVision, and more recently Ms. Marvel and Moon Knight, and apparently a very giant Daredevil Born Again reprisal. We'll see what that's going to be, but apparently something in the neighborhood of 20 episodes in that when that happens. But Secret Invasion was supposed to be an extension of the Skrull storyline introduced in Captain Marvel, where Ben Mendelsohn famously played Talos, one of the main Skrulls, and of course it was all part of Samuel Jackson's character Nick Fury's backstory. And so this was supposed to be a telling of, the big famous comic book story Secret Invasion, where the Skrulls are essentially taking over one person at a time, planet Earth. And the show's kind of a dud. I absolutely personally love everything the Marvel Cinematic Universe does. And to be clear, there were Marvel TV shows that weren't really Marvel Cinematic Universe shows. This is your Daredevils and Jessica Jones and Luke Cages that were on Netflix years back. And of course, even, less successfully, the Inhumans. So ultimately, as far as a show that the Kevin Feige Marvel Cinematic Universe has been tied to, this is, at least critically speaking, one of the least successful, coming out with an overall score of 55% on Rotten Tomatoes. And then the final episode, the 6th episode, which just aired the other week, at least as of press time, checking just before I got on the air today, a whopping 7%. I won't editorialize too much on this because there certainly have been tons of really brilliant Marvel shows and movies, but something about this one just horribly kind of missed the mark. And I will personally say I was really excited to see Samuel L. Jackson totally kick ass and be Nick Fury and to have a whole story dedicated to him and, not be this kind of little cameo thing they've always done with him. Samuel Jackson's a world-class actor. He's amazing. Should have been a great story. And of course, they also had, Ben Mendelsohn, who's a phenomenal actor, and Emilia Clarke, who was great as Daenerys Targaryen on Game of Thrones. And it just kind of came through as a mess. A lot of characters with weird motivations, a lot of things that don't really add up, a lot of things, I don't want to give any massive spoilers here, but certain characters siphoned off of the story that were wonderful and just seemingly turned into cannon fodder. I mean, it just wasn't great. And coming on the heels, as many people have been kind of rumbling that the MCU, which for a long while there never made a bad movie or a bad show, now a lot of people got there thinking that maybe they're losing focus. Maybe this is yesterday's news. I wouldn't want to be in Disney and Marvel Studios, corner. I wouldn't want to be in part of the team that has to make all of this stuff work well. And of course, very likely part of the problem is they've been making too much. When you make so many things, it's hard to focus. It's hard to, find the kind of talent you need to make everything great. Whatever the case may be, I would not recommend Secret Invasion to anybody but the most hardcore of Marvel Cinematic Universe fans and fans of the whole Kree-Skrull War business. If you're a big comic book dork, you know what I'm talking about. So, moving on into the world of games. Now, this is all according to a website called Video Games Chronicle. This is all their sourcing, and nobody officially has commented on this. But according to the site Video Games Chronicle, they claim they have numerous sources indicating that Nintendo almost already has a new console that's going to be ready for the market pretty soon. According to Video Games Chronicle, it's going to come in the back half of 2024, aimed specifically for that time frame instead of earlier than that time frame, purposely to avoid having problems with supply. Now, there's been a lot of problems, especially because of the pandemic, the lack of plastics, the lack of steel, how the pandemic basically crippled everything. PlayStation 5 kind of came out, and then for a good 2 years there, most people couldn't get a PlayStation 5 that wanted them. They couldn't make them quick enough. And they were sold out pretty much any time that they came on sale. So according to Video Games Chronicle, this release in late 2024 of this, at this point, unannounced and unnamed new console coming on the heels of their very successful Nintendo Switch, which if you're not a person that's a gamer, it's really wild because it both works as a console and big TVs, and then you can take it like as a little tablet, and then you can play the same games on the tablet. It's pretty smart, pretty well done, as many things Nintendo has done over the last bunch of years. But ultimately, according to Video Games Chronicle, they're aiming to avoid these supply chain problems to launch in late 2024. It might, according to Video Games Chronicle, have an LCD screen rather than a more expensive OLED screen to try to keep the cost down, to try to get in as many people's hands as possible. But it also, there's no word, at least as of this point, on any form of backwards compatibility. Now, in the world of video games, this has always been kind of one of my big sticking points, which, I don't think any game company's ever done a good enough job, which is if someone spent several years investing money in all these games for this previous version of the platform, the new version of the platform, you're going from one version to another, should support those older versions of games, even if it's maybe not any upgraded graphics or sound or anything. It's just the same game, just running on a more modern system. There's no reason that shouldn't work. I mean, if you bought a cassette in the early days of cassettes and then you put it in a cassette player now, it works. If you had a compact disc and you bought it in 1988 and then you got a CD player in 2001, the CD still worked. It didn't matter if there was better audio technology that had been created. It was still possible. Now, of course, this isn't universally true. There certainly have been instances of consoles that have gone through and made some measure of backwards compatibility possible. And there's certain things in terms of like digital storefronts, which is becoming more common. But at any rate, we'll bring you more news and more reporting when there is anything official, if there is. Right now, this is all coming from this one publication, Video Games Chronicle, so take it with a grain of salt. And then a really interesting thing for music fans and festival goers. Now, if you're not familiar, in Europe, there is a gigantic festival scene, has been for a long time, of genres of all shapes and sizes. Also, the world of heavy metal enjoys a giant circuit of big music festivals over there. I mean, it's a big part of those bands' economy because there's much greater demand for bands of that genre over in Europe than there even is here in America. That isn't to say there isn't hard rock and metal festivals here. There certainly is, and there's a whole bunch of the Danny Wimmer Presents ones that are all over the West Coast and in the Midwest, and so there certainly are versions of it, but not quite like Europe. Europe has a whole bunch of really successful hard rock and metal festivals, and also festivals in general. Take Primavera Sound, for example, have no issue having genre bands of every kind of style of music. You'll see your Rosalia's in the same bill with like Cannibal Corpse. That's not unusual to music fans over there. There was a little bit of that in some of the festivals here, in the early years of the festival explosion here in America, but nowadays it's more or less pop stuff. You have generally what's in the top 40 kind of Dominion and a little bit of indie stuff, a little bit of dance music. It isn't really counterculture anymore in the American festival scene the way that it used to be. But at any rate, there's a very big festival scene there. And there's kind of this running trend, which is starting to become problems all over the place. There's reports of festivals here in America, little events, little festivals being canceled in the wake of incredible heat. We've had a giant, terrible heat wave happening here. So this is one of those cautionary tales of if you're circumspect about climate change and you're not really sure that you believe climate change is a real thing, well, extreme weather and the impact of that extreme weather is starting to become more of a thing. And this particular week, the impact is being felt most by what's called the Wacken Open Air Festival. Now, this is a very, very big heavy metal festival. It's been around a very long time. And this year's particular installment, not to name the entire roster, but it was prominently featuring bands such as Iron Maiden, Halloween, Creator, Megadeth, and the recently reunited Biohazard, who are wonderful if you don't know them from the early 90s. And ultimately, there was a series of things that happened all in short succession, whereas, it's kind of extends over 4 or 5 days. But then ultimately there was a statement issued because there was extreme rain. There's really heavy rain happening, and it was basically turning the grounds of this open air festival into a big mud bog. And so the festival issued a statement right as like the first day that anybody could come. It wasn't even like the main event into the Friday, Saturday, Sunday stuff. Just as the first day was coming through, they ultimately said, All journeys to Wacken open air with motor vehicles of all kinds must be stopped with immediate effect. Due to the ongoing difficult weather situation, the resulting condition of the camping areas, event areas, and access roads unfortunately means that no more motor vehicles can enter the camping area. Therefore, all metalheads and motor vehicles of all kinds are urged to cancel their trip to Wacken if already en route or not to start at all. I'll read that again for you. Are urged to cancel their trip to Wacken if already en route or not to start at all. This applies until the end of the festival. For those vehicles that are already currently in the immediate vicinity of the festival at the Holy Ground, don't know what that means right offhand, we continue to make every effort to get you on site. We are very sad to have to make this difficult decision for the first time in the history of the festival. Now, this year's particular installment of the festival sold out within a couple hours. 85,000 attendees expected. It's a big number for any festival. You know, Coachella usually does something in the neighborhood of 110, 120,000 a day, something like that. 85,000 metalheads is a pretty awesome number for a genre that nobody really ever wants to take seriously. Now, that was one day. So basically, don't drive here. If you're not already here, you can't get here by walking or some other way, don't come. Now, in all my years paying serious attention to music and music festivals, and I've heard of cancellations, I've heard of tragedies happening and the whole festival having the plug pulled on it. I've never heard of a festival that's still happening telling people, don't come. Hey, you on your way here? Bugger off. Don't even bother. Don't do this. Go home. Of course, no word in any of this on refunds. I have to assume that that's going to be a thing they're going to do. If you aren't able to be allowed to come to something you paid for, they can't just take your money. I don't know. I don't know about local laws in Deutschland up in Germany, but I guess we'll find out about that. But then a day later, it got even a little more kookier, which I think is just absolutely fascinating, which is they issued another statement, and this came Wednesday. Considering the weather conditions, the reasonable visitor capacity for Wacken Open Air 2023 has now been reached. Any further travel must be stopped and canceled with immediate effect. For the first time in the history of Wacken Open Air, WOA is how they listed it at this point. But so, being clear here, this decision has been made. We are very sad, but the continuing difficult weather situation unfortunately leaves us no other choice. So ultimately, something in the neighborhood, it's estimated of maybe 40 to 50,000 of those 85,000 people got in the door. And then ultimately, nobody else is allowed in. It's too muddy. It's too messy. Nothing is really working. You cannot be here. Don't be here. Don't come in. In all my years, I've never heard of anything like that, where there's a festival, it's still happening, the bands are still playing, and there's people who are being told no one else is getting in. I mean, I suppose that the site probably safely allowed by like local ordinance a certain number of people. If it wasn't a giant mud bog, then being a mud bog, it probably is less safe. But wow. Also, interestingly, just as a side note, because this is also just other news about the big, German festival that's basically come up. Lemmy Kilmister, who is the famous singer known usually as just as Lemmy of the famed band Motorhead, who died in late 2015, and it was just kind of a paragon for, that kind of proto-metal, proto-punk, that late 70s thing before thrash and other kinds of metal became thing, and then kept playing and touring all the way until his death, basically. Some of his ashes have been scattered in said mud bog that is the Wacken Open Air Festival. Apparently, Lemmy did many different things, or Lemmy's estate, or Lemmy's will, whatever the case may be, dictated all kinds of things that they wanted to be done, including having some of his ashes fashioned into bullets, which he had sent to his friends. I don't think usable bullets, but, like commemorative bullets that had his ashes in them. But apparently some of it was a part of what they called Lemmy Forever festivities. They had a little event, and apparently they scattered some of his ashes there. So rest in peace, Lemmy, and I suppose a fitting tribute to a real legend of that area. A very quick other note in the world of games. The PlayStation 5, Sony's PlayStation 5, has announced that they very proudly announced that the PlayStation 5, which I mentioned earlier, has had all kinds of supply chain issues and all kinds of supply chain problems, ultimately has sold 40 million units. Now, there's not a lot of detail out there in terms of the competition, right? Because the other big competitors in the space of video game consoles are the Nintendo Switch, which has said something to the effect of 18 million units have been sold of their console, and the Xbox. and the Xbox X and the Xbox S. And ultimately, there isn't really a solid number on how many units the Xbox has sold. Apparently, in some statements, they've claimed a 21 million user install base, but what that means is kind of unclear. So ultimately, it's a kind of a big bravado statement to come out, and it confirms the suspicions a lot of people in the world of video games have had, which is that PlayStation's basically king of the mountain and has been for some time, had some of the best first party IP in terms of video game consoles. It's not surprising to hear that's likely what the case may be. And then lastly, and what I would call, just another in a series of just incredibly crushing sad news. We talked about how Sinead O'Connor passed away last week. Paul Reubens has passed away, and this happened on Monday. And if you're not familiar with Paul Reubens by his name, you probably know him by his often assumed character name, Pee Wee Herman. Paul Reubens was a comic and an artist who had worked with the Groundlings and other improvisation troupes going all the way back to the early 80s. He was a good friend of the late legendary and one of my favorite comedians of all time, Phil Hartman. They were good friends. And Pee Wee Herman, the unusual high-pitched character that wore a bow tie and was incredibly over-exaggerated, was born in this time and started becoming a mainstay of the LA kind of comedy scene. It was a show that he used to put on, which then ultimately was a little bit more of an adult show in its time and was picked up by HBO. Reportedly, as far as I understand it, it was also the origins of where Mr. Bungle, one of the better bands you're ever going to hear of the last 20, 30 years, heard their inspiration for their name, which was an old 50s film strip about a character named Mr. Bungle. If you've ever heard the first self-titled Mr. Bungle album, you can hear an audio sample of that 50s film strip, which was kind of aimed at, making kids think, don't be eclectic and weird and don't not fit in. You'll be embarrassed and be terrible and no one will like you. Anyway, it's a little piece of history that I just thought was interesting. And then, of course, this character, Pee Wee Herman, went on to be a part of a couple different major movies, one directed by Tim Burton, which was Pee Wee's Big Adventure, and then there was a sequel of sorts, which was called Big Top Pee Wee. And Paul Reubens kind of continued to stay in the limelight through many different years and different formulations, and also was in a couple different movies, including Batman Returns as a small part as the Penguin's parents, and then ultimately the Johnny Depp starring drug dealing movie Blow, which is a very unusual role for him, but he was very good in it. And ultimately had been kind of quiet in the last bunch of years, and we kind of know why now, where apparently Paul Reubens had been privately suffering and fighting. Another instance of this is just a super tragic and unfortunate battle with cancer. And ultimately, there was a statement that it was issued posthumously. It's obviously something he wrote before he passed on, just knowing that the end was coming. And he said, "Please accept my apology for not going public with what I've been facing the last 6 years. I've always felt a huge amount of love and respect for my friends, fans, and supporters. I have loved you all so much and enjoyed making art for you." Now, many people might know Pee Wee's Big Adventure, but for me personally, I was really young at the time. I think I was like 8, 9 years old. It was a show that was decently popular at that time that was kind of an offshoot of that, and it was a much more kid-friendly show, and it was called Pee Wee's Playhouse. For those of you that don't know it, it's amazing to think that if you go back and you watch it, not only Phil Hartman was on that show playing Captain Carl, which is a character he used to play in the live show, but also Lawrence Fishburne played a character called Cowboy Curtis. And there was all kinds of crazy crap in cartoons. It was silly, it was ridiculous, but it was very popular at the time. In a post on Instagram, Paul Reubens' estate issued the following statement. "Last night we said farewell to Paul Reubens, an iconic American actor, comedian, writer, and producer whose beloved character, Pee Wee Herman, delighted generations of children and adults with his positivity, whimsy, and belief in the importance of kindness. Paul bravely and privately fought cancer for years with his trademark tenacity and wit. A gifted and prolific talent, he will forever live in the comedy pantheon in our hearts as a treasured friend and man of remarkable character and generosity of spirit." Rest in peace, Paul Reubens. He was 70 years old. Now, for our story this week, because as I mentioned, we have a feature interview again. This is going to be the second in a long series. Every week we have the show, we're going to have a special interview at the end of each broadcast. And whereas last week's was with the actress Angelique Bomani, this week we're going to have an interview with Patrick Trick Jarrett from Wizards of the Coast. Now, this and all the rest of the interviews to come over the next 5 or 6 weeks all came from when our games editor and I, Zach Dalton, attended Summer Games Fest the other month, which was an amazing private event for press and basically kind of the heir apparent to E3 as E3 got canceled, and was just a really wonderful event to be able to experience games and speak to the people who are the creators and builders of them. So I thought it would be appropriate to talk about Magic the Gathering. For those of you that don't know, Magic the Gathering is a game. Okay. It's kind of a rib, as it were, from Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is all different kinds of characters. One of the kinds of characters in Dungeons and Dragons is wizards. Wizards usually read from a spell book. So Magic the Gathering's creator, Richard Garfield, came up with the ingenious idea of making a game where the whole premise of the game was everybody was a wizard with a spell book. And it was almost like the wizard wasn't always finding the spells that he needed at the time that he needed. So the game, as it were, worked using the mechanic that baseball cards had always used, cellophane packs, where you buy a pack and get a random assortment of cards. You wouldn't necessarily get exactly what you wanted. You might have to trade. You might have to buy multiple packs. It's an incredible capitalistic mechanism, to be sure. But, kids have been doing that behind sports cards of all stripes for decades, going back 80 years, at this point. Magic the Gathering was invented in the early 90s and basically was brought to public in, I believe, early 1992, and was kind of conceived as you could endlessly customize and make a deck of cards and then ultimately play against one or numerous opponents. You play cards that are known as lands that provide for a thing called mana. You use that mana to cast spells, either creatures or artifacts, wizardry stuff. Really great stuff if you're into, dorky fantasy culture. And I can tell you, with some measure of certainty, I regard it, and I play a lot of games in my life, as basically the best game ever made, except for chess. Just to give you a sense of how high of an esteem I hold the game for, it is, once you get into it, once you understand the mechanics, ridiculously fun. It is, of course, a financial endeavor. It costs money to stay up with it, and most people don't. Most people play for a couple years, and Magic just keeps churning out sets. Apparently, coming all the way back to 1992, there's over 100 different expansion sets that have been released. So when they originally started the game, there were 3 sets called Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited. Basically the same thing, just reprinted in larger print runs, the way comic books might. And ultimately, everything after that has been some measure of an expansion set, where they add new cards with new meanings and new rules, and then you can keep customizing and changing your deck. So there is literally no way to play this game the same way twice. It doesn't matter if you play the same deck for a year. It is never the same. And usually the fun of the game is people keep making different decks and keep modifying the decks and keep testing them. It is an incredible amount of fun. I thought for today's story, I'd just talk a little bit about how I came to this, because it was a wild little piece of kismet, and ultimately was a thing that when my high school years came through, it was my favorite thing to do along with playing basketball. It was the big thing. Music, basketball, and this were basically my teenage years. So ultimately, my father had a store in Winsted, Connecticut, and it's hard to describe what that was. It was all different manner of stuff. It was, baseball cards and comic books and antiques and food and ice cream and rented video games, all different kinds of crap that was there. And of course, because, we were a little bit younger, I was probably about 12, 13 at this time, as this was all coming around. Usually my sister and I were there. Couldn't really go home. My mom was working. My dad was working the store. My mom had a job somewhere else. And ultimately, we would be there. So when we weren't in school, we would usually be there. If we weren't at home with our mother on the weekends, we were usually at the store. Sometimes she would have to help man the store, or my dad did something else. And ultimately, we would be there. So sometimes I was just doing homework. Sometimes I go play basketball. But a lot of times, especially in the cold weather of Connecticut, which is a good portion of the year, I'd just be there bored. Now, there was a guy, I'm not going to say his real name, but we'll just call him Carp for the sake of simplicity, who used to kind of hang around. And he was just one of those people in our town who just was always around, didn't really seem to have anything to do. And ultimately wore like super like 80s Hesher style clothing, right? Like black pants, black jeans, black leather jacket, and literally wore a giant industrial grade chain. Massive chain, and he wore it like a bandolier, like an old West gunfighter would. And why he ever had that, I never understood. I think he fancied himself a punk. I don't know. I think he thought of himself in like punk rock style. And apparently, one time, me just being bored sitting around, he just started having a conversation with me. And then he mentioned this game, Magic the Gathering. And it was something that I just was like, what are you even talking about? And he explained it's a game with cards. You buy different packs. You get creatures. The creatures fight. You cast spells. You do these things. And of course, me being a nerd, 12, 13 years old, this was music to my ears. And I was like, wow, that sounds really great. He's like, oh, it's such a wonderful game. It's so much fun. I don't know why he was playing it. I don't know how he got into it. I don't know why he even wanted to talk to me about it. But maybe it was just the kind of thing that you did in those days. If you found something cool, you shared it with anybody who would actually listen. So wasn't really easy to know how to do this at the time. And in those days, at least in Connecticut, finding something from a game like this, the packs that were sold and the things that ultimately were possible for it, you had to go to, usually there was like the stores that sold computer games. And that was the only place that we could find something like this, at least at that point in Connecticut. It became very popular in the few years after this. So one time in a trip to the mall, those of us that are of this age bracket probably remember malls were everything in the 90s. People went to malls in the 80s and the 90s quite a lot. And that's where people did a lot of shopping and browsing. I mean, there was no cybersphere. Everything was in the mall. And my mom bought me a couple of packs and a couple of starter decks. And I literally spent the better part of 2 weeks just dorking out, looking at every single card, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I didn't understand this game that this guy had told me about. I didn't know how it worked. I was reading the rules over and over again, and I don't know what it was. I couldn't figure it out. The rules were probably clearly spelled out, but I just didn't quite understand the mechanics of the game. But being completely fascinated by what it meant, I was determined to get into this. I really, really badly wanted to do this, and I wanted to be able to see if this was fun. So I literally kind of had to track this guy down. It wasn't the kind of guy that usually I would have the confidence as a very dorky 12 or 13-year-old to go find. But I spent the better part of the next several weekends just kind of wandering Main Street in our town, hoping to run into him. I mean, I'm surprised my dad even let me do it, because that wasn't kind of a thing that my parents encouraged at that point. They, I think, were in that very early 90s, everyone's going to murder you place. And so I don't think I was encouraged to do that. But somehow I was able to convince my parents to let me just wander around. And then finally one night, pretty late, might have been a Friday night, I don't remember, I just finally saw the guy in front of the one all-night donut place in Connecticut, or in Winstead, which at the time was a place called Best Eaten Donuts, just a really crummy coffee shop and donut store. And I basically said, I've been trying to find you, all excited, and I found some packs of Magic, but I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make it work. Can you please teach me? Please. And he kind of had this all right, kid kind of thing. And I remember he took me to the house where he stayed. It turned out he lived kind of rent-free with his older sister. He was definitely in 19, 20 years old place. I mean, he probably should have had a job and, had his own place and everything like that, but he was crashing with his sister. She apparently had a boyfriend who had a computer and computer games, and I think he might have been the one that taught Carp how to play Magic. So we spent the better part of an hour or two on the floor of his older sister's apartment with him teaching me the mechanics and me badly trying to get it right. And that basically started a several-year addiction. Carp and I didn't necessarily play all the time, and he was into very different things. And, I don't know, wasn't necessarily my favorite person in the general sense, but I'm always grateful, even to a person I don't necessarily like anymore, that he introduced me to what this world was. And so then me and several of my closest friends became big fans of Magic the Gathering, and we would drive all over Connecticut and Massachusetts to go anywhere where there were tournaments for it. There was a place in West Hartford, Connecticut called the Dragon's Lair, of all things, which was kind of everything fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons, all of that different kind of stuff. I mean, this is when it was not cool to be doing this stuff, but this kind of was where it started to become cool. And this is where all the 15-year-olds were. And it was where all the freaks were. It was like home. So in those days, once I got to be 15, 16 years old, and of course, especially when I got to be 16 years old and I could, I had a car and I could drive myself to West Hartford, Connecticut, an hour and a half away. This was as good as my first concert, as far as feeling at home and accepted. Everyone was a bit weird. Everyone was a bit unusual. Everyone was super friendly and open, and everyone just wanted to dig into the mechanics of this game. I don't think I was ever terribly great at it, for what it's worth. I mean, I got a lot of great cards in those days. And, for any of you who are actually listening to this that understand what Magic the Gathering is, I had a couple of the boxes in the big blue, and at that time it was like, whoa, they're $100 a piece. And now they're worth something in the neighborhood of several $1,000s a piece. And sadly, I don't have them anymore. But anyway, point being, I invested a lot of time and effort into it, but I didn't really care. It was just fun. It was just wonderful. I pretty much got out of it after college. I played with some friends in college, and I had a really great time playing whenever there was a chance to play. But then ultimately, kind of moving on from college and getting into adult life, having jobs, kind of got out of it for a very long time to return to it some years back. And it's still really a brilliant, incredible game. Now, I can't keep up with constantly buying cards and buying new packs and new sets, and Magic releases like 4 or 5 sets a year. But if you're ever a person who's looking for something fun to do, or you have kids and you're looking to do something fun with them, that's a great thing to do on a rainy day or a long night, or when you're just tired of watching movies and shows, I swear, one of the best games ever made in that respect. There's not always a ton of reasons because, Mixdown covers music, movies, video games, and television, where we often have an intersection with this, but I'm thrilled that we were able to do this and able to have this conversation with Trick. So ultimately, with that, I'm going to bring you right into the interview with Patrick Trick Jarrett, and where we talk about the at the point that we were speaking, the newest set of Magic the Gathering, which was Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth, an entire gigantic set, an expansion set where almost every single card, not almost every single card, was at least inspired or directly created with the notion of the official Lord of the Rings license, and is all your favorite characters from the Lord of the Rings books and settings, and then just beautiful, brilliant art. And this is the many, many, many sets of this game. This is probably some of the best art for the cards, as far as it's just gorgeous. One of those things that's worth owning, even if you don't play the game, just because they look really beautiful, especially if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings. And there's a ton of people out there that are fans of Lord of the Rings. So we're going to get that interview started right now. And just like in the previous weeks, going to sign off now, but stick around because that interview is going to start in just a second. So I just wanted to say, as a programming note, we're going to be here every week, roughly 5:30 p.m. Pacific, and each of the next bunch of weeks, there's going to be one of these interviews at the end of the show. There's going to be a whole bunch of them coming from our Summer Game Fest content, and then we've got some other stuff that's really cool we're going to be announcing soon. We thought we'd be ready to announce it right now, but we weren't. It's coming, I promise. There's going to be a lot more information on that soon. So I wanted to thank all of you joining us on the live stream. I wanted to thank everyone who engages with our content anywhere that you engage it, whether it's in YouTube, whether it's in YouTube Shorts, or whether it's any of the social media sites where we post clips from this, whether that's in Instagram and Reels, or whether that's in Twitter or in Facebook, or soon to be the Mixdown TikTok that's coming in imminently, I'm told by our team. And ultimately, thank you for engaging with us. Please join us each and every week. We'll have lots more headlines, lots more stories, lots more interviews, and a lot more video content to come. So thanks again for joining us. Stick around for the interview. So glad to see you well. All right, here we go. Raymond Flotat from mxdwn.com here. We are at Summer Game Fest again. All kinds of crazy stuff going on here. And we are at Magic the Gathering. And I'm here with Patrick Jarrett, who goes by Trick.
That's right.
Such a pleasure to meet you, Patrick.
Absolutely. Pleasure to meet you.
Indeed. And so we're here talking about the newest expansion, which is called
Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth.
How many cards are in this expansion?
I forget the exact number, honestly. There's a lot. We have the main set, then we also have commander decks, we have Jumpstart, we have all sorts of different ways for people to see Lord of the Rings characters and cards in the set.
Is it like north of 300?
Yes.
Okay, so it's a large set.
I can tell you that I know we commissioned over 900 pieces of art for this set. So across all the different variations and things like that, there's several hundred cards as well.
Is there, Lord of the Rings is a huge lore, right? Like the hugest of lores I think there is besides the Wheel of Time, right? And is every single major character in this?
Not every single character. Okay. So we're focused on just the Fellowship of the Ring trilogy. Okay. There are some cards from outside of that because they're referenced in the books. Mm-hmm. Like we have a Smaug token because he's mentioned as part of the the Bilbo saga of what his writings were. Yep. But we don't have things from the Silmarillion. We don't have things from the CD series or anything like that. No. But from those 3 books, we went deep. There's characters all the way from the main Fellowship down to Butterbur, Bree Innkeeper, or Build a Pony.
Build a Pony.
Build a Pony has a card,
awesome.
all those sorts of things. So we got a lot of them in this set, though.
Very beautiful, beautiful. And so we were talking a little bit as we were just playing a game Magic. Of course, we didn't film any of that, but as far as the mechanics of the One Ring, perhaps for people who aren't the biggest Magic fan, people who don't know Magic well, how does the One Ring work in this set?
So what we did was we introduced a mechanic called Tempted by the Ring. And so what happens is when you are tempted by the ring, it introduces what we call an emblem into the game of Magic. And that's just a thing that sits off to the side, represents that we've now introduced a new sort of set of small rule tweaks for how the game works.
Yes.
And when you are first tempted by the ring, you choose one of your creatures to be the ring bearer.
Yes.
And at the first level, that ring bearer now becomes legendary because they are carrying the one ring.
Of course.
And they become unblockable. And that's just the first level. Now, when you're tempted again, it increases to the second level, and it changes how it affects. And this goes all the way for 4 different levels to be as you're increasingly more and more tempted by the ring. And your ring bearer thus becomes more and more powerful as Sauron and the One Ring's power takes hold over them.
Wow. And effectively, one of the things that's always been key about Magic is that, Magic has its own mechanism of modern, and like it's constantly kind of cycling in new players.
Right.
What I've always found in my dealings with Magic, and just, and occasionally trying to get cards I want, right, whether they're from recent sets or older sets, but effectively, like, people kind of age out eventually. They're in for a few blocks, and then they kind of put it aside for a while. And so this set particularly, is there a notion in the making of the mechanics of this set, how it all works? Is this aimed for more introductory people, or is this aimed for like those people who are obsessive, masters who are into everything that the game does?
I mean, it's really meant for both of those groups. Like, obviously, we want to keep as many players who are in the game happy and enjoying it.
Yes.
But also, being able to reach Lord of the Rings fans, being able to speak to these people who maybe are either aware of Magic and haven't had a reason to check it out.
Yes.
Or also, if you're a Magic fan who has a friend who's a Lord of the Rings fan but hasn't been interested in checking Magic out, it's a great way to sort of introduce them to this game that you already enjoy.
Yes.
So it is definitely approachable for new fans. Like you and I were playing just now with our starter kit, which is 2 60-card decks meant to be played against each other.
Right.
But also, it's got 4 commander decks, so you're ready to grab one of those and jump into a commander pod with friends. And then also, it's just Magic. The game is still the game.
Right.
And the mechanics, while new, aren't overly complex, aren't something crazy that new fans will be overwhelmed by. So it's approachable by new players. It should be enticing and exciting for existing players.
Right.
So we're hoping across the whole spectrum.
One of the things that I've stumbled upon is there are like math nerds out there that game out the probability of pulling certain cards in this. Now, the One Ring, the one ring, you know what I'm talking about? The 1 of 1, right? Like, I've seen a lot of crazy stuff about that already, and it's going to be like the golden ticket from the Willy Wonka movies, right? Like, this is why this is going to be its own band apart. Like, someone like me, sure, great, but I'm not expecting to win the lottery either, right? Like, I'm not expecting to pull the One Ring. For me, what draws me in is like we were talking about before, right? There's either the mechanics that do something really awesome and exciting, make the game really cool, or there's art that's really good. And I don't often vibe on the art, but in this one, as we were talking about, like, I'm drooling over half of the cards that I've seen. And I know I haven't seen everything. I know not everything's even been announced. So kind of they ask the question is like the more recent era of Magic has been a lot of the set boosters versus the collector's boosters. And there's kind of its own controversy in that because certainly like an average kid isn't going to be going for collector's boosters. That's more collector's people. So I know that certain of the cards, like the One Ring, for example, beyond the one ring, just the normal version, and then there's like an alternative art version, an extended art version. I mean, in terms of like the probabilities of this, do you have any sense of the scale of like the print run, how much is going to be out in circulation for a lot of this?
So the packaging actually covers this and tells you, if you look on it, what your odds are of opening various forms of cards.
Okay.
I don't know them off the top of my head. But, the entire desire here is for it to be exciting for fans, the people who want to go after the collectability, go looking for those exciting variations on cards, whether it's the 1 of 1 ring in the collector boosters and where else it can be found, or if it's the variations of the Nazgul, or if it's the scene arts that we've introduced, like Pelennor Fields, where you have 18 cards making up a single piece of art. Yeah, exactly.
That's me.
So it speaks to this different segment of our audience who are driven and want to experience that as well as playing the game.
Now, talk me through just a little bit in terms of, your everyday existence in Magic. Where is your part in connecting with all this and the mechanics and how things are coming together?
So my work for Wizards largely focuses on how we put this out to our fans.
Okay.
I'm on the marketing comms team. I focus on previews with Blake, and who is well known for Weekly MTG and stuff like that.
Yep.
I work on our social media, putting posts out, videos and stuff like that.
Got it.
So that said, I also do talk to people in studio, and
right.
I contribute occasionally to products. I didn't contribute to Lord of the Rings, but I've been at Wizards for 11 years, so I've worn a lot of different hats over the time.
A lot of different things that you've done. So you're concerned with a lot of how are we trying to, I want to say present, but how are we trying to reach people with, like, here's what you're going to get from this. Here's what's going to happen in this set. Here's why it's special. Right,
exactly. I'm trying to help people because, people who might have heard of Magic will have a decision, have gone, either that sounds cool or maybe it's, maybe that's not for me.
Right.
And so, like, Lord of the Rings is a great chance for us to sort of have that conversation again, perhaps with those people, or with new players who have never had an opportunity. It's just a chance for us to say, hey, this is what Magic's about. So how do we best present this to those new different audiences? How do we best put our foot forward and talk to the fans?
What's interesting to me, knowing is, the specifics of, your day-to-day, how much are you engaging with what, not engaging isn't the right way of putting it, how much are you listening and reacting to what people out there are saying? Because, Magic is a kind of thing like, I don't know, being a fan of Grand Theft Auto, right? There's such a gigantic install base of people, and going now back decades.
Right.
There's people from 7 different eras of Magic at the point that it's been around. It's like being a Frank Zappa fan. It's kind of like falling down an endless hole, right? And different people have very different notions of what is like, in my day, we did it this way. This day, there's a lot of different, super preachy opinions on what makes Magic right or good. How much are you listening or paying attention to what people are out there saying in terms of when you're thinking about putting a set like this together and thinking of mechanics or cards?
Sure. We like to say we are stewards of Magic. We make the game, but it's our fans who make it amazing. It wouldn't be what it was if people weren't playing it. So it's important to us that we take feedback from our fans and we consider their things. That said, being a physical game introduces a difficulty in being reactive.
Right.
Sometimes, we take feedback from a set, but we're already working 6, however many sets further out already.
Yes.
So it's slow for us to be able to necessarily implement a learning change from one set to another.
Yes.
But we are always listening, always taking feedback, and when we're able to be reactive, when fans have feedback and they're right, we try to adjust course and make changes.
Gotcha.
I think a great example is actually our MagicCon tournament conventions that we're starting to run. We ran Magic 30 in Las Vegas last year, had a lot of learnings from that. Implemented changes for Philly, had a lot of learnings from that. And when we got to Minneapolis, fans were really happy. We've gotten a really good basis and structure for these events, but we're still learning. We're still doing new things. We're still changing things up. And we've got a lot of fun stuff coming up from events to these sets and all of that sort of stuff.
So beyond the One Ring, what are any, I've obviously seen some, and it's escaping out my brain right now,
Sure.
But what are other mechanics that are new to this set that people haven't seen in Magic before?
So there's Tempted by the Ring. We talked about that one briefly.
Yes.
There's a mass orcs, which isn't a new mechanic, but it is a new spin on a mechanic. Because we used a mass previously in War of the Spark to represent building a zombie army.
Right.
Well, obviously, it makes perfect flavorful sense. The entire flavor of what Sauron and Saruman are doing during Lord of the Rings' story is amassing an army. And so what you're doing is you're building, you get an orc token, and you get to add counters to it as you're slowly building it. So like a card might say amass 2, gives you a 2/2 orc army. But then the next card says amass orcs 1, and that 2/2 becomes a 3/3. And then there's other cards that go, when you put a token on an army, add 1 additional one. So now if you're like an amass 2 with that card out, that now becomes an additional 3, so now it becomes an orc army 6/6. So that's one of the additional flavor mechanics. The other thing we did was we brought food back. Food's been a recurring theme for a couple of sets, starting back with Eldraine, but it's a central theme here because of the hobbits. And one of the things that we all think about the hobbits is they know how to live the good life.
Sure.
They enjoy their food. They enjoy
11sies.
6 meals a day.
Yeah.
And so food became a central theme for us with them. When it comes to the elves, what we did was we looked at them and looked at specifically Galadriel and Elrond, if you think about them, and their magical powers.
Yes.
And Galadriel has her portents and ability to look in her bowl. And so scrying is a big mechanic for the elves of the Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. So we really took those mechanics. And so the only really new one is Tempted by the Ring.
Right.
But we brought these other mechanics and made them central to this set to represent these different groups and how they might play or interact in the story.
Excellent. Trick, I really appreciate your time.
Of course.
I really appreciate all your knowledge and playing some games with me, and I very much look forward to seeing more of this when I finally get a chance to get some of it myself.
So your first chance is going to be next week. The pre-release will be happening 16th, 17th, and 18th at local game stores.
Beautiful.
And then it'll be on sale in all stores globally starting the 23rd.
Excellent.
It'll be also on Arena before then, but honestly, I don't remember that date. It's the end of the second day here at Game Days, and so I'm starting to drag it.
You and me both.
I feel you.
All right, sir. So good to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.